I talk about the ego a lot, and a lot of people, quite frankly, have a lot to say about what it is that I share in my perspective on the ego. You see, I think the ego is something that is important for us to have. In many spiritual teachings, it is said that the ego is the part of us that creates suffering, the part of us that is ultimately evil and creates the pain and trauma that we go through in life. And I do agree with that to an extent. But I also think that the ego has a purpose. And it is because we are not aligned with what the ego's purpose is, and we simply kind of ignore the ego, then the ego has the ability to use its abilities, use its power, use its talent to ultimately create the suffering that we experience in life. But when we align our consciousness with ego, then we have the true alignment, the true connection of bringing balance to life. You see, for me, the ego is the anchor, the thing that tethers us to this reality. Because we chose to play this game of life, we, in fact, have to have the ego, right, in order to play the game. It's like you need to have a basketball in order to play basketball, right? You need to have a baseball in order to play baseball. So that being said, if you want to play the game of life, then you have to have the ego. That is part of the game, you see. And the idea of getting rid of the ego and still play the game just doesn't really work, right? It doesn't work for me anyway. Some people may align with the idea of shedding the ego and experiencing an ego death. It doesn't align with me, right? So that being said, getting into the ego, you are not the ego, but the ego is you. Now, there's a lot to unpack in this statement, right? You are not the ego, but the ego is you. Now, who are you? Truly, you are pure consciousness. You are the spark. You are God identified, individualized as you. You are ultimately God having the experience of life as you. We all are. Now, that pureness, that who you are deep down within you, that is your consciousness. That is the core of who you are. As we talk about ego, and we talk about, again, anchoring yourself to this reality, to this world, to this experience, to this identity known as you, you must have an ego. Now, when you understand that, then you can maneuver through life easier, understanding the connection and even sometimes what appears to be a contradiction, right? Or a contrast, right? Light and dark existing simultaneously at the same time. Two opposites, up, down, left, right, front, back, all of those things happening and being in the same moment in time at the same time, right? That is consciousness, that is ego, existing at the same time to bring balance to the individual, to the unit. Now, as you go through life and you experience and understand this connection with ego, you begin to truly understand purpose in life, what that means and what it means to exist and what it means to be here and why you are here and understanding how to play this game, almost professionally, so to speak, right? On a professional mastery-like level. Now, as you recognize that, and most people already know this, right? That you are not your ego, but they don't recognize that the ego is you though, okay? So I'll repeat this again. You are not the ego is you. So what the ego is a projection. The ego is an illusion, so to speak, or a avatar or a image. You think of a 3D image or a hologram, so to speak, of who you are based on the experiences that you've had in your life. So though deep down, the core of who you are is pure consciousness, the ego is a projection of all of the things that you've experienced thus far in this world and how you've dealt with it. So you are pure consciousness, but your ego is the part of you that has been developed, molded, shaped, right, as a result of all the things that you've experienced in this world from the very beginning, even the very beginning, meaning conception itself. Because again, the ego's part or purpose is to anchor you to this reality, to this game of life. So though, right, you are not the ego, right, you are pure consciousness. The ego is the parts of you that you have to process through, change, rearrange, accept, manipulate, understand, have a conversation with, connect with, in order for you to bring balance to the exchange that is constantly happening between consciousness and ego. You see, they both need each other. They're the yin and yang of your experience here. And once you understand that you have to balance that yin and yang in order to bring true happiness and fulfillment to your life, then, right, you begin to see the joy, the happiness, the fulfillment. But if you don't understand and acknowledge those things, there's going to be a conflict within you. And that's why you'll notice with a lot of people who are on this conscious spiritual journey, and they read all the books and they studied all the techniques and they follow all the gurus and they identify with this shedding of the ego, they often find themselves really, getting flustered, getting upset about me saying that the ego is necessary, because they're identified with not identifying with the ego. They identify with killing the ego, letting go of the ego. And you have to ask yourself, whenever you are upset with what somebody else is sharing, you have to identify that it isn't about what the person is saying. It's about you. Why are you triggered by that? Why does that bother you? Why does that interfere with your space? And that's because you are not in true balance with what it is that you believe. Because somebody who is in true balance with their understandings of self and what they believe, then is not threatened at all by anything that anyone else says, because they have found their peace and their reality and their understanding about self and life. So recognize that the ego is an important part of life. It is not the enemy. Okay? You have to understand the ego. You have to connect with the ego in order for you to not let the ego control you and create a space for you to be triggered, create a space for you to feel unhappy, to feel threatened, to feel imbalanced. Once you connect and understand the balance of consciousness in the ego, then you understand true peace, true mastery of self. So continue to go on that journey of bringing balance to yourself. That's what the balance is about. You see, balance, you cannot be balanced if you are focused purely on consciousness, because the scale is then tipped if you are purely focused on consciousness. But if you are focused on consciousness and its opposite, and truly understanding that they two need each other, then you absolutely truly bring balance to the scale. You see, you need both. You need two things to bring balance. That's why we talk all the time about balance. You cannot balance one thing. It is imbalanced. So for those who are on the spiritual journey, recognize that. And you may wonder, even though you're on the spiritual journey, a lot of people are somewhat fooling themselves to think they're at peace, but they're really not. Something is going on deep within themselves. And it's because they are really not in balance. They are identifying with a way and tricking themselves to know balance, but it's really not. It's disharmony. It's frustration. It's anger. It's all of these things that are buried deep within. And that's why we experience a lot of people who are on the spiritual journey who are quite, frustrated all the time, angry, often offended, often upset. Doesn't make sense. And it's because they're truly not understanding the balance within themselves. So recognize that in order to be in true balance, which is the mission of spirituality, right? That's what we talk about all the time, being balanced. You must have two things to balance. Those two things are consciousness and ego. Thank you so much. Continue to join me on this journey. Peace and abundance always.